Thomas smiled broadly as he handed his corporate credit card to the receptionist at the front desk. The young woman standing beside him, her fingers wrapped tightly around his forearm, let out a soft, audible gasp of pure admiration. The grand lobby of the hotel looked as though it had been meticulously lifted from the silver screen, a breathtaking display of polished white marble floors, towering crystal chandeliers, and an elegant, heavy silence that spoke volumes. Everything about the environment transmitted power. Everything about it transmitted vast, unadulterated wealth. "Wow, Thomas, you really know how to choose the most exquisite places," Beverly whispered, her eyes wide with excitement. Thomas simply smiled, fully enjoying the intoxication of that specific sensation. He deeply loved being admired, and he especially loved it when people believed he was always one step ahead of everyone else, holding the keys to a grander world. He picked up the silver-embossed key cards from the counter, never bothered to glance at the specific name engraved on the metal plate, nor did he notice the subtle, repeating emblems detailed on the high walls, the heavy doors, the moving elevators, or the uniforms of the staff. It was a discreet, highly elegant symbol, the kind of detail that only truly existed for those who actually knew how to look. Thomas was not that kind of person, because men like him rarely pay attention to the finer details of life, particularly when they operate under the profound delusion that they already control the entire narrative. As the elevator silently glided toward the upper floors, the phone in his pocket vibrated with a sharp, familiar buzz. It was his wife, the woman he had left behind at their home in Boston. Early that morning, the woman to whom he had lied without even blinking an eye. "Honey, I arrived safely at my destination," he said smoothly as he answered. "That is good to hear," her voice replied calmly, sounding exactly as peaceful and steady as it always did. "Is the hotel nice?" Thomas glanced over at his mistress, who was currently smiling up at him, and answered without a single second thought. "It is nothing special, really. Just another hotel." On the other end of the crowded airwaves, there was a short minute silence, a tiny gap that was almost completely imperceptible to the untrained ear. Then she simply replied, "I understand," and the line went completely dead. He carelessly slipped his phone back into his pocket, completely unable to imagine that her simple question had not been asked by mere coincidence. He had no way of knowing that his wife already knew exactly where he was standing, and he possessed no idea that this was not just any ordinary hotel. This grand establishment was the exact place she had spent years of her life painstakingly rebuilding from the ground up, a historic property that carried her own family's legacy, a place that existed solely because of her strength, though he did not know it yet. In that fleeting moment, all Thomas could see was Beverly smiling by his side, wrapped in the dangerous, thrilling illusion that he would never be caught. He had no inkling that every single step he took inside this building was leading him directly into the absolute worst night of his entire existence. The penthouse suite was nothing short of extraordinary, a masterpiece of modern luxury that felt grand and intimate all at once. Beverly stood completely frozen near the entrance for almost a full minute, her mouth slightly open as she absorbed the sheer scale of the room. Thomas, acting with the casual confidence of a frequent traveler, walked straight to the massive floor-to-ceiling glass window. The view outside was breathtaking. The entire city of Boston seemed to stretch out beneath their feet, the historic harbor beautifully cut by the fading golden light of the late afternoon, and the distant hills painted in that rich purple hue that the end of a New England day always creates. "Not bad at all," he remarked with that heavily moderated generosity of a man who desperately refuses to look overly impressed by anything. Beverly stepped up behind him and wrapped her arms tightly around his waist, leaning her head against his back. He accepted the warm embrace with a cold, wandering distraction, his mind already skipping ahead to their upcoming dinner, the expensive wine he planned to order, and how wonderfully the rest of the evening was going to unfold. He was absolutely not thinking about Lillian, his wife. He was not thinking about anything other than the immediate, pleasurable present. This happened to be one of Thomas's greatest talents, living completely in the present moment when the present was convenient, and entirely forgetting every other responsibility he had. A bit later, while Beverly was occupying the bathroom to freshen up for the evening, Thomas decided to go down to the lobby by himself because he wanted to smoke a cigarette. The hotel possessed a beautiful outdoor area, a lush lateral garden filled with elegant lounge chairs and a classic stone fountain that created a constant, soothing rustle of water, making the chaotic world outside feel instantly calmer. He sat down on a stone bench, struck a match to light his cigarette, and it was precisely then that his eyes caught something on the side wall of the garden. It was a very discreet plate made of dark bronze, featuring highly refined, raised lettering. The inscription read, "This garden was created in honor of the vision and determination of its founder, whose immense courage transformed this empty space into something far greater than four walls." Grand opening 2019. Thomas took a deep drag of his cigarette and exhaled a thick cloud of smoke, reading the words a second time. Founder, he muttered to himself. The person being honored was not just a passing guest. It was the actual human being who had brought this entire magnificent place into existence. He frowned slightly for a brief second, pondering the thought, but then he quickly discarded it, assuming it was probably just some wealthy heiress who had inherited a massive fortune. Someone with deep family money, he concluded, as he stubbed out his cigarette and walked back inside the warm lobby. In the wide corridor of the second floor, there was a beautifully curated photo gallery displaying the history of the building. Thomas walked past it with absolutely no intention of stopping, but Beverly suddenly paused, her attention captured by a specific frame. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a large, black-and-white photograph encased in a heavy wooden frame. It depicted a massive construction site in progress, filled with complex scaffolding, wet cement, and busy laborers working hard in the background. In the exact center of the frame stood a young woman wearing a sturdy hard hat, holding a clipboard tightly in her hand, her chin lifted high as she looked toward the top of the unfinished building with an expression of pure determination, as if she were accurately calculating the future. "What an incredibly strong woman," Beverly remarked, admiring the image. Thomas glanced at the photograph for no more than 2 seconds, his mind elsewhere. The face of the woman was not completely sharp or clear due to the vintage contrast of the print, and he either did not recognize her or simply refused to let his mind make the connection. "Come on, let's keep moving," he said impatiently. But Beverly stopped once again, just a few paces down. It was another photograph, this one showing a grand opening ceremony. A bright red ribbon was stretched across the entrance, and a pair of shiny scissors was held firmly in the hands of a woman wearing a stunning white dress who was smiling radiantly for the camera. Beverly inclined her head, studying the details. "There is something so familiar about that face," she murmured. "She looks just like..." Beverly did not finish her sentence. She just kept staring at the image. "Looks like who?" Thomas asked, shifting his weight. "I don't know. She just looks like someone I've seen," she replied, shaking her head. "Forget it." Thomas did not ask any further questions, but for a split second, a small detail in the corner of the photograph caught his eye, the very same discreet emblem he had seen on the walls. He did not stop to examine it. Down at the lobby bar, Thomas ordered a glass of expensive scotch, wanting to relax before dinner. The bartender was a gentleman of about 50 years old, possessing a thick, graying mustache and a pair of wise eyes that looked as though they had witnessed absolutely everything the world had to offer. He poured the amber liquid with that silent, flawless precision that belongs only to true professionals. Thomas looked around the room, noting that the bar was almost entirely empty at this particular hour of the evening. There was a table with 2 older couples conversing quietly, a lone woman reading a book, and an executive speaking softly into his phone. "Have you been working here for a long time?" Thomas asked the bartender, mostly just to break the silence. The bartender nodded slowly as he picked up a clean glass to polish. "I have been here since the very beginning," he answered. "Since the beginning? What do you mean by that?" Thomas inquired. "I mean since before this place was even a hotel," the bartender explained, pausing for a moment. "This entire building sat completely abandoned for nearly 6 years. No investor wanted to touch it. Everyone in the city said it was a dead project, a total waste of money." Thomas raised his eyebrows in mild surprise. "And then what happened?" he asked. "And then she appeared," the bartender replied, a small, genuine smile forming on his face. The kind of smile people only make when they speak of someone they truly admire, from the bottom of their heart. "The owner," he continued, placing the polished glass safely on the shelf. She is a woman who possesses absolutely no fear of any wall, whether it is made of solid concrete or the invisible walls that people constantly try to put up in front of her. Thomas took a slow sip of his drink. She still shows up here from time to time, the bartender added, raising his eyes to look directly at Thomas as if holding back a deeper truth. And whenever she appears, everyone in this building knows it. Thomas did not quite understand the weight of that observation, but the word lingered heavily in his mind. Owner. He paid his bill and walked back up to the penthouse, carrying a persistent question he could not seem to shake. Who exactly was that woman? 8 years. Thomas and Lillian had been married for 8 long years, and if you were to ask him to describe exactly what his wife did for a living, he would carelessly say, "Oh, she manages some real estate projects, coordinates a few property things. I don't know the exact details." It was not spoken out of deep cruelty. It was something far worse. It was spoken out of complete normalcy. Lillian had tried to tell him many times. In the early days of their marriage, when everything between them was still fresh and exciting, she would come home bursting with energy, holding newly signed contracts, detailing completed structural inspections, and talking about corporate partnerships she had built entirely from scratch. Thomas would listen, or rather, he would pretend to listen, with his smartphone held firmly in his hand, the television blaring loudly in front of him, and his head entirely in another universe. "You are a very hard-working woman," he would say dismissively. "But you really don't need to kill yourself working so hard, right? We don't actually need the money." He spoke as if her career were nothing more than a tolerable little pastime, as if the grand things she was actively building held no real weight or consequence in the modern world. He treated her as though she were a schoolchild working on a little science project that was never going to lead anywhere meaningful. Over time, Lillian simply stopped sharing her achievements with him. It was not done out of explosive anger, but rather out of a wise economy of personal energy. She learned that certain profound things must be saved exclusively for the people who actually possess the capacity to see them. And Thomas, for some reason that took her years to fully comprehend, simply did not possess the ability to see her. 3 years prior to this night, when the Grand Hotel was just about to have its official opening, she had attempted to share her world with him one final time. "Thomas, I really want to show you something important tonight," she had said, walking into the living room. He was deeply engrossed in watching a football game on television. "Can it wait?" "The game is at a critical point right now," he mumbled. "No, it is important," Lillian replied, taking a deep, steady breath. "I bought a major historic building downtown. We are officially opening a luxury boutique hotel this coming April." Thomas turned his face toward her for a brief second, a look of confusion crossing his features. "A hotel?" There was a heavy pause in the room. "Do you even have the kind of money it takes to do something like that?" Lillian looked back at him, her expression holding no anger, but rather something much heavier, a profound, quiet disappointment. "Yes, Thomas, I do have the money," she answered softly. He immediately turned his face back to the television screen. "Okay, that's great. Tell me all about it later." That later never arrived. April came exactly on schedule. The hotel held its grand opening, and Lillian stood proudly at the center of the entrance, holding the shiny scissors as she cut the bright red ribbon. Journalists were everywhere, cameras flashing constantly, and major international investors were warmly shaking her hand, telling her she was the absolute surprise of the year in the luxury hospitality sector of Boston. Thomas, meanwhile, was away on a weekend fishing trip with his closest friends. She had not insisted on him attending the event because she already knew, deep in her soul, that it was simply not worth the emotional effort. 5 years before that opening, when Lillian was navigating the most brutal and agonizing phase of her professional life, everything seemed to be falling apart. She was constantly negotiating with stubborn banks, dealing with a lead architect who suddenly vanished into thin air, and managing a dishonest business partner who betrayed her trust and left her, holding the entirety of a massive corporate debt. One evening, Lillian arrived home utterly destroyed, emotionally and physically drained. She sat down on the living room sofa and simply stared into the empty void of the room, feeling the crushing weight of the world on her shoulders. A few minutes later, Thomas walked through the front door, absolutely bursting with excitement. He had just received a major promotion at his firm. "We need to celebrate right now," he shouted happily, rushing to open a bottle of expensive champagne. He filled 2 crystal glasses to the brim. "Life is going absolutely amazing for us." Lillian took the glass he handed her, forced a warm smile onto her face, drank the champagne, and said absolutely nothing about the immense burden she was currently carrying by herself. She remained silent because she already knew exactly what he would say if she spoke up. And so, she hid her pain away, held it silently, resolved the crisis by herself, and rebuilt the entire project alone. And when the grand design finally stood firm on its own feet, when the financial stability returned, and when the very first guest walked through the main doors and remarked that this hotel was the most beautiful place they had ever seen in their entire life, Lillian locked herself in the bathroom of the presidential suite and wept completely alone. Her tears were not shed out of bitter anger, but out of pure, unfiltered gratitude, because she had achieved her dream without needing a single ounce of validation from anyone else, especially not from him. It was almost 6 o'clock in the evening when the entire fabric of Thomas's reality began to violently unravel. Thomas and Beverly had gone down to the exquisite restaurant located on the 14th floor of the hotel. They were seated at a prime table with a stunning panoramic view of the city lights, holding a menu that featured no printed prices, a luxury reserved exclusively for guests who never needed to ask about the cost of things. Beverly was radiating happiness, and Thomas was deeply satisfied, wrapped in that lazy, arrogant satisfaction of a man who firmly believes he is in total control of his destiny. It was the waiter who noticed her first. He subtly turned his head toward the main entrance of the restaurant, a gesture so faint it was almost imperceptible to anyone else. It was the exact kind of movement people make when they instantly recognize someone of immense importance. Thomas did not see it initially, but then the head maitre stopped abruptly. In the middle of a sentence, he was speaking to another guest, looked toward the door, and walked over there immediately, moving far too quickly for it to be a casual encounter. Sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy, Thomas turned his neck to look. Standing at the entrance of the restaurant was a woman, conversing quietly with the maitre. She was dressed in remarkably simple but elegant attire, a pair of gray tailored trousers, a cream-colored blazer, and her hair was pulled back neatly without any exaggeration. Beverly also turned her head, and found herself staring a second longer than was polite. There was something undeniably captivating about that woman. Beverly did not know exactly what it was, but she could feel it. There was a distinct power in the way the woman stood, a commanding presence that made the physical space around her seem much larger and more significant than the space surrounding anyone else in the room. The maitre d' bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound respect. The woman smiled kindly, said something in a soft voice that Thomas could not hear, and then began to walk gracefully toward the dining tables. Thomas quickly turned his attention back to Beverly, trying to ignore the distraction. "This wine is exceptionally good," he remarked, pouring a bit more into her glass. "It is wonderful," Beverly agreed, but her eyes remained entirely fixed on the woman in the cream blazer who was walking past the tables. 2 minutes later, the general director of food and beverage appeared at the edge of the dining room, looking anxious. Shortly after, the executive head chef himself came out of the kitchen and walked straight toward the entrance, a rare occurrence that chefs of his caliber never do for ordinary dining guests. A customer sitting at the table directly next to Thomas whispered softly to her husband, "Look, that is her, the woman who owns this empire." Thomas turned his head once more. The woman in the cream blazer had taken a seat at a private table near the large glass window. She was entirely alone, but she did not look lonely in the slightest. Instead, she looked perfectly at peace, completely occupied with her own deep thoughts, a delicate cup of hot tea resting on the table in front of her as she gazed out at the brilliant city lights below. Thomas studied her face, and as he did, he suddenly felt a strange, vague discomfort wash over him. That uncomfortable sensation your brain experiences when you see someone familiar completely out of their usual context, and your mind takes a painful second to process the reality. He looked closer, examining the neatly tied hair, the elegant structure of her jaw, and the familiar way she inclined her head slightly to the side when she was deep in thought. No, it is absolutely impossible, he whispered to himself, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. He was far away from home. It had to be a mere coincidence. He forced his eyes back to his companion. Would you like to order some dessert, Beverly? But Beverly did not answer him immediately. She was still staring intently at the woman by the window, her brow furrowed as she tried to remember where she had seen that distinct face before. But then, slowly turned her head and looked directly at the table where Thomas was sitting, her eyes locking onto his for 2 long, agonizing seconds. Thomas felt his stomach violently turn over, a wave of pure nausea hitting him. There was absolutely no room left for doubt. It was Lillian. It was his wife, sitting in the very same restaurant, in the exact same hotel where he was staying with his mistress. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him pale as a ghost. Beverly was saying something to him, her lips moving, but Thomas could not hear a single syllable. His mind was in a state of absolute collapse, frantically trying to assemble some form of logic out of the chaos. She is here. How does she know? Why is she here? He quickly grabbed his cloth napkin, pretending to casually wipe his mouth. I need to use the restroom immediately, he stammered, standing up from his chair before Beverly could even open her mouth to reply. In the quiet corridor that connected the main restaurant to the elevator banks, he stopped, leaning against the wall as he tried to breathe. He took a deep breath and made a firm decision. He was not going to go up to the room. He needed to understand what was happening. He walked back toward the glass viewing partition of the corridor. Lillian was still sitting at her table. A female hotel employee had just approached her, holding a digital tablet. Lillian was pointing calmly at the screen with a stylus pen, giving detailed instructions. Why would a member of the hotel staff be showing corporate documents to an ordinary hotel guest? Thomas hurried down to the front reception desk, trying his absolute best to sound casual. Excuse me, the lady who is currently sitting alone in the restaurant. Is she a guest staying at this hotel? The receptionist raised his face, maintaining a perfectly neutral, unreadable expression. Is there anything else I can assist you with, sir? Thomas froze, instantly understanding the unspoken message. The answer was a definitive no. She was not a guest. He hurried up to the second-floor gallery, standing in front of the historical photographs once again. He looked at the woman in the hard hat, and then at the woman holding the scissors at the grand opening. He examined the structure of the face, the proud tilt of the chin. He backed away before he could finish the thought. He did not want to finish it. He returned to the table, where Beverly asked if he was all right. I am fine, he lied, his voice shaking. Just a sudden, severe headache. Beverly said nothing, but she looked at him with a different expression, as if she too were beginning to put the missing pieces of the puzzle together. When dinner ended, Thomas practically dragged Beverly toward the elevators, moving with a frantic haste she did not comprehend. Inside the elevator, she asked again, Did something happen? Nothing at all. Just exhaustion, he replied, staring at his reflection in the mirror, completely failing to recognize the man looking back at him. The following morning, Thomas woke up exceptionally early, long before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. Beverly was still fast asleep in the massive bed. He dressed himself in complete silence, moving like a ghost. He descended to the lobby because he desperately needed fresh air. He needed to understand the truth. He stopped in front of the photo gallery for the 3rd time, his eyes locking on to the grand opening photograph. He pulled out his phone, snapped a high-resolution picture of the image, and zoomed in on the woman in the white dress. The face became perfectly sharp, and his stomach twisted into a tight knot. It was not just a striking resemblance to Lillian. It was Lily. Yet, there was still a massive piece of the puzzle that his mind refused to lock into place. Why would she be the one cutting the ribbon if her name appeared nowhere in his life? He walked into the hotel's breakfast cafe, sat down at a corner table, opened his internet browser and typed into the search bar, Grand Dame Hotel Boston owner. The very first results that appeared were glowing travel reviews and high hospitality scores. He scrolled down further until he found a major business feature article. The headline read, "The most desired luxury hotel in Boston has an owner, and she built it entirely alone." He clicked the link. A large cover photograph loaded at the top of the page, showing a woman smiling brightly at the camera. It was the exact same woman from the white dress in the gallery, the exact same woman from the restaurant the night before. Directly beneath the photograph, the caption read, Lillian Foster Carvalho, founder and sole proprietor of Grand Dame Hotels. Thomas sat frozen, staring at the glowing screen for a period of time he could not even begin to measure. He began to read the first paragraph of the article, his heart pounding wildly against his ribs. Lillian Carvalho did not need to prove anything to anyone, but she proved everything to herself with $12 million invested entirely from her own pocket, 3 years of brutal financial negotiations, a near-declared corporate bankruptcy, and a fierce stubbornness that she herself describes as simply refusing to accept the word no. Lillian transformed the historic, abandoned commercial building, which had been left completely vacant since 2013, into the Grand Dame, a hotel that in just 18 months became the absolute pinnacle of luxury hospitality in the United States. Thomas paused his reading, slowly lowering the phone onto the wooden table, staring blankly at his untouched cup of coffee. $12 million from her own pocket. 3 years of her life. A near-declared bankruptcy. He vaguely remembered a time, a few years back, when she had looked incredibly stressed, when she would arrive home late into the night. He remembered asking her once what was wrong, and she had simply replied, I am just resolving a minor issue. And he had casually accepted that vague answer, turned his back to her, and gone right back to watching his football game. I am just resolving a minor issue. $12 million, 3 years of her existence, and he had treated it as nothing. He picked up the phone again, continuing to scroll, and it was in the second news article that he found the detail that shattered his soul completely. It was a photograph he instantly recognized from the grand opening. Lillian had actually sent him this exact photograph via a text message 3 years ago, accompanied by a simple one-word message. I did it, and he had replied with a single heart emoji and immediately gone back to whatever unimportant thing he was doing at the time. The article quoted her. I asked Lillian if there was anyone during the grueling process who doubted her vision. She smiled a very particular smile, the kind of smile worn by someone who carries a deep history they choose not to share, and said, there are always people who simply lack the capacity to see what does not yet exist. I learned early on that this is their profound limitation, not mine. Thomas read that specific sentence 3 times over, his chest tightening. He scrolled to a 5th article, a short, direct piece from a major financial publication. Grand Dame Hotels officially rejects a massive acquisition offer from an international luxury chain for an estimated value of $80 million. According to sources close to the founder, the definitive answer was delivered in less than 24 hours. No. Thomas stared at the number. $80 million. She had turned down $80 million without a single moment of hesitation. He remembered a night, about 2 years ago, when she had come home looking entirely different, quieter than usual. He had asked if everything was fine, she said yes, and he had gone to sleep without another thought. That was the night she had rejected $80 million, and he had simply gone to sleep. Thomas was still staring intensely at the screen when he heard the distinct sound of calm, measured footsteps approaching from the lateral corridor. He lifted his gaze. Lillian walked into the breakfast cafe, wearing the exact same simple, elegant clothing she had worn the evening before. She spotted him immediately, and she did not look away, nor did she turn around or leave the room. Instead, she walked straight in his direction, moving with the steady confidence of someone who had already rehearsed this exact confrontation in her mind a long time ago. She did not look the least bit surprised to see him there. And that was precisely what broke something deep inside Thomas. The absolute, total absence of surprise on her face. She knew he was here. She had always known. Lillian approached his table slowly, pulled out the heavy wooden chair directly opposite him, and sat down. She looked into his eyes. For the first time in his entire life, Thomas found himself completely at a loss for words. You knew? He finally managed to stammer out. It was not spoken as an accusation. It was a painful realization. Yes, she replied calmly. Since when? Since the exact moment the reservation was made, she said, placing her hands flat upon the table. Her hands were perfectly still, completely stable. The hotel system automatically flags the name of the individual responsible for booking the penthouse suite. You used your corporate credit card, Thomas. A heavy, suffocating silence fell between them. "Why didn't you?" He paused, unable to finish. "Why didn't I what?" she asked, inclining her head slightly. "Make a scene? Create a massive public scandal? Storm into your suite?" She paused, looking at him with pity. "No, Thomas, that is absolutely not how I operate. You really should know that about me by now." He should have known, but he didn't, because he had never paid enough attention to her to ever understand how her brilliant mind functioned. "This hotel is entirely yours?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "It is," she answered. "For how long?" "We have been open for 3 years, and it took nearly 6 years of intense planning and construction before that. 6 years. While he was sleeping soundly in the bed right next to her, she was actively constructing a luxury empire. While he was out drinking with his friends, she was leading high-stakes corporate meetings. While he was dismissively saying, "You don't need to work so hard," she was literally saving a multi-million-dollar project from total ruin. "I truly did not know," he said, and there was a tone in his voice that was not an excuse, but pure, unadulterated astonishment. It was the astonishment of a man who had just realized he had been completely blind for a decade. Lillian looked at him for a long moment. "You did not know, because you never bothered to ask, Thomas," she said, speaking without a hint of cruelty, but with a profound calmness that cut deeper than any screaming match ever could. "I tried to tell you, many times, but you were never truly present. Not really." Thomas opened his mouth to defend himself, but he quickly closed it. There was absolutely no argument he could make, because she was entirely right. The elegant breakfast cafe continued to function seamlessly all around them. Waiters in pristine uniforms were serving fresh food. Families were laughing and conversing quietly, and soft jazz music floated gently through the air, the ordinary, luxurious life of the hotel moving forward without a care. And yet, at the very center of it all, 2 people sat face to face after 8 full years of marriage, one who had built a massive financial empire in total silence, and another who had stood right beside her without ever truly looking at her. "Why didn't you ever force me to understand?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with honest confusion. "I did tell you, Thomas." Her voice was completely serene. "Not just once, but dozens of times. Draining your energy to speak to someone who refuses to listen is exactly the same as staying silent. Over time, I simply stopped trying. It was not done out of hatred or bitter anger, but out of absolute respect for myself. I learned that my grand achievements do not require your approval in order to be real." That sentence dropped upon Thomas like a crushing boulder. "My achievements do not require your approval in order to be real." He looked around the immaculate dining room, watching the staff move with flawless, quiet efficiency, admiring the fresh flowers arranged perfectly on every single table, and gazing at the stunning view of the harbor outside. All of this magnificence had been born directly from the mind and the hands of the woman sitting right in front of him, while he had spent years patronizing her, calling her hard-working, as if it were some cute little character flaw. "What is going to happen to us now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Lillian gently opened the palm of her hand on the table. "My legal team will be reaching out to you early this week," she said firmly. Thomas closed his eyes in despair. "Lillian, please, no." "Yes, Thomas," she replied with absolute clarity, holding no anger but showing the unshakable resolve of someone who had made a definitive decision and possessed no doubts. "I am not here to engage in a loud fight with you. I am not here to humiliate or crush your spirit. I am here today because this is my hotel, and I needed to personally oversee a major operational issue last night. You saw me in the restaurant. I chose not to create a scene, but none of this changes what was already decided long before this weekend. My choice was made prior to any of this." She looked at him, and in the heavy silence that followed, the absolute truth became clear. The betrayal with Beverly was not the cause of their downfall. It was merely the final, undeniable confirmation of a reality she had felt for a very long time. They had become complete strangers sleeping in the very same bed. The love that had once existed between them had completely dissolved, not in the fire of explosive arguments, but in the cold, slow poison of his total indifference. "I am so deeply sorry, Lillian," Thomas said, and for the very first time in his life, the words were completely genuine. He offered no excuses, no deflection, no attempts to minimize his actions. He finally felt the true, crushing weight of what he had done, and everything he had failed to do over 8 long years. Lillian looked at him for one final, extended moment. There was an expression in her eyes that was incredibly difficult to define. It was not hatred, it was not intense disdain, but rather the quiet, peaceful sadness of a woman who had loved a man with all her heart, only to realize that her love had been completely wasted. Not out of pure malice, but out of sheer arrogant blindness. "I know that you are sorry now," she said softly, "but feeling regret at this late hour cannot undo what has already passed." There was a brutal, undeniable truth in those words. Regret arriving too late cannot return the stolen years. It cannot bring back the lonely nights she came home, bursting with excitement only to find him completely distracted. It cannot recreate the critical moments when she desperately needed a true partner and found only a silent spectator. It cannot give her back the grand opening night she had to celebrate all by herself because he chose to go on a fishing trip, fully believing that his life was going perfectly well. Lillian slowly stood up from the table, picking up the cup of tea that a waiter had placed before her without her even needing to ask, because her staff knew exactly what she desired without a word. "Take good care of yourself, Thomas," she said gently. There was no hidden irony in her voice, no traces of venom. It was her genuine wish. She had loved this man deeply. She had tried her absolute best. She had attempted to build a life by his side, and now she was walking away forever. She was leaving not as a broken victim, not as a defeated soul, but as a powerful woman who had firmly decided that her precious time and emotional energy were far too valuable to ever remain invisible again. Thomas sat frozen, watching her as she walked gracefully across the wide cafe. The hotel employees greeted her as she passed, showing a deep, genuine respect that can never be bought with money or faked with training. A shift manager crossing her path stopped to ask a quick operational question. She answered him with a calm nod, and he thanked her politely. The bartender from the lounge passed by, carrying a silver tray, and bowed his head with deep reverence. She smiled at him warmly, a true, authentic smile. It was the exact kind of smile that is reserved exclusively for the people who truly matter in one's life. Thomas realized, with a sickening pang in his chest, that he had not received that beautiful smile from her in many, many years. He sat alone at that corner table for a very long time after Lillian had vanished from sight. His coffee grew completely cold. He ordered a second cup, but it too grew cold as he simply stared out the window at the bustling city of Boston. He finally forced himself to stand up and walk back to the penthouse suite. Beverly was awake, sitting up in the grand bed while scrolling through her smartphone. She smiled brightly the moment he walked through the door. That light, effortless smile of a person who carries absolutely no heavy burdens in life. Thomas looked at her, and a sudden, sharp clarity pierced his mind. Beverly had done absolutely nothing wrong to him, but she had also given him nothing of real substance. She had built absolutely nothing with him. She had simply been available at the exact moment he had chosen to close his eyes to the extraordinary treasure he already possessed at home. He had traded a magnificent, brilliant queen for a shallow illusion, not out of deep love, but out of pure cowardice, emotional laziness, and a pathetic refusal to look at his own life. "We need to leave right now," he said flatly. Beverly raised her eyes, confused. "Right now? Why?" Thomas looked around the spectacular penthouse suite that his own wife had brought into existence. He looked at the luxurious bed where he had slept while betraying her, at the massive windows showcasing the precise view Lillian had carefully selected for her guests, and at every single architectural detail that served as a direct reflection of who his wife truly was. She was a woman who created immense beauty out of nothing, a woman who saw grand potential where everyone else saw abandonment, a woman who held 12 million reasons to give up on her dreams, and yet refused to quit. A woman he had looked at for 8 full years without ever truly seeing. "Everything has happened," he replied quietly, turning his back and walking out the door. Down in the grand lobby, he stopped at the front desk. The same receptionist from the day before was standing there. Thomas looked at him, and the receptionist returned his gaze with that trained, flawless professional neutrality. But Thomas could see the truth now, because he was finally paying attention. He saw the subtle discomfort, the understanding glances exchanged among the staff, and the heavy silence of the employees. They knew exactly who he was. They knew precisely what he had been doing in the penthouse, and they had executed their duties with absolute professionalism while carrying the painful burden of serving a man who was actively betraying the woman they loved and respected. "Thank you for everything," Thomas said quietly. The receptionist offered a polite, professional nod. "Have a wonderful day, sir." Thomas walked toward the grand exit. The massive glass sliding doors opened automatically, and the crisp world outside suddenly felt much smaller, colder, and far more empty than it had appeared when he first arrived. Lillian was not going to spend the remainder of her day thinking about Thomas or weeping over the demise of her marriage. She possessed a major corporate meeting scheduled for exactly 10 o'clock in the morning with the lead architect of her second hotel property. Yes, her second grand establishment. She had officially signed the real estate acquisition contracts 3 months prior in the historic city of Savannah, Georgia, a beautiful, historic building located directly in the heart of the Southern District that desperately required meticulous structural restoration and a grand, creative vision. Lillian possessed both of those things in abundance. At exactly 10 o'clock sharp, she was seated at the head of the long mahogany table in the private conference room of the Grand Dam, the blueprint designs laid out beautifully before her. The lead architect was enthusiastically explaining the structural possibilities of the historic property. She listened to his words with an absolute total concentration, a distinct quality that people always commented on whenever they worked with her. When Lillian was present in a meeting, she was entirely there, not glancing at her phone, not letting her mind wander, but completely invested in the present moment. She had learned the value of presence the hard way by spending 8 long years of her life living alongside a man who was never truly there for her. She had made a sacred promise to herself that she would never be that vacant person for anyone else, whether in her professional career, her deep friendships, or her future romantic relationships. When love eventually returned to her life, and she knew with absolute certainty that she would be ready. She knew her own immense value, not out of arrogant pride, but out of absolute crystal clarity. It was the unshakable clarity of a woman who had walked directly through the fiery furnace of life and emerged infinitely stronger on the other side. It was the clarity of someone who had constructed a massive dream entirely from scratch, while every single voice around her insisted that it was completely impossible. She understood deeply that the most critical recognition a human being can ever receive does not come from the outside world. It comes from within your own soul. Later that afternoon, she took a slow walk through the peaceful lateral garden of the hotel. She stopped directly in front of the dark bronze plate, reading the elegant inscription once again. She read those familiar words not out of shallow personal vanity, but for the sake of true memory, to ensure she never forgot where she had come from, to remind herself of exactly how much it had cost her to stand here, and to remember that the absolute most agonizing moments of her life were the precise moments when she had been forced to become her truest, most authentic self. Directly beside the bronze plate, etched subtly into the stone, was the same discreet emblem that adorned the entire building, firm, elegant, and unyielding just like her. At that very same hour of the afternoon, Thomas was sitting entirely alone inside his car, completely trapped in a massive traffic jam on the highway leading out of the city. His smartphone was held tightly in his hand, and Lillian's name was open on the screen, the cursor blinking empty inside the text message box. He had no idea what to write to her, because there were absolutely no words in the human language grand enough to measure the astronomical scale of what he had so carelessly lost. There was no combination of sentences that could ever be sufficient to bridge the gap, and there was no apology on earth capable of undoing 8 long years of making her feel entirely invisible. He slowly placed the phone down on the empty passenger seat beside him, looked out at the unending rows of cars stretched before him, and for the first time in a very long time, he sat in absolute, complete silence. It was not the lazy silence of a man who was distracted by the world. It was the heavy, painful, and agonizing silence of a man who was finally completely present. When we look back at the grand tapestry of a long human life, we eventually come to realize a profound and deeply human truth. The most severe consequences in this world do not arrive in the form of explosive arguments, dramatic screaming matches, or the public scandals that the entire neighborhood can see. The absolute greatest punishment that can ever be inflicted upon a person is the silent, peaceful departure of a good woman who simply stops trying. It is the moment when she quietly closes that sacred, beautiful part of her soul that used to wait up for you, the moment she decides to step forward into the future, carrying absolutely no hatred or malice in her heart, but wrapped in a profound, unshakable peace. It is the peace that belongs exclusively to a soul that finally recognizes its own immense worth, a soul that decides it deserves infinitely more than emotional scraps, and possesses the immense courage to go out into the world and claim that destiny, whether you choose to walk beside her or not. True maturity, which often only arrives after we have lived through many decades of mistakes and heartbreak, teaches us that human relationships are not sustained by the mere physical presence of two people, sharing the exact same roof or sleeping in the exact same bed. They are sustained by the deliberate, conscious act of choosing to truly see the person standing right in front of you, to see their silent struggles, to celebrate their hidden victories, and to actively honor the magnificent world they are building inside their own minds. Far too many people spend their youth operating under the tragic delusion that the people who love them will always be there, waiting passively in the background, serving as mere background actors in their own selfish personal dramas. They treat the immense efforts of their partners as expected, normal pastimes, completely blind to the fact that silent water runs deep and that the quietest people are often the ones carrying the heaviest mountains. When you choose to ignore the brilliance of the person beside you, when you treat their grand achievements with a lazy indifference and deny them the basic validation they deserve, you are not destroying their worth. You are simply proving your own complete inability to perceive greatness. The world is filled with brilliant, resilient individuals who are actively constructing empires in total silence, navigating the darkest storms of life without a single complaint, and finding the strength to rebuild their dreams from the absolute ashes of despair. They do not require your permission to be strong, and they certainly do not need your shallow approval to make their triumphs real in this world. And when they finally choose to walk away from you, they do so with a terrifyingly beautiful finality, leaving behind an empty space that can never be filled by anyone else. Lillian signed the official commercial contracts for her second luxury hotel property at exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, using the precise same fountain pen she had used to bring her very first hotel to life years ago. She had no close family members standing beside her in that corporate room, no emotional witnesses to hold her hand, and absolutely no one to share a celebratory toast with at her side. And yet, as she pressed the ink onto the paper, she felt absolutely no loneliness, and she did not feel the lack of anyone's presence in the slightest. She had lived through enough seasons of life to learn the ultimate lesson. She had learned how to be her own truest witness, how to love her own journey, and how to clearly see her own immense value even when the entire world chose to remain completely blind.